Well, hey everybody, it is Pastor Martin. It's Thursday night, and I knew I'm usually not on here on Thursday nights, but tonight I'm doing a podcast. And since I was doing the podcast, I wanted you to be a part of my podcast tonight. It is something that I do besides doing lives. I do podcasts also. Let me do this real quick, and I'm going to jump right into the conversation tonight. And please do me a favor and like and share with someone tonight so they can be a part of this conversation, especially those that are in ministry and those that doing ministry. I want you to please let them be a part of this on tonight. Do me a favor, wherever you're viewing from, please like, share, make comments on tonight as we get into this conversation. Yeah, please do that tonight. Please like, share, and we'll do and get into this conversation on tonight. Well, let's get into the conversation. Every time you go on YouTube or go on TV, whether it's football or basketball, you always hear the conversation where everyone's talking about the GOAT, the greatest of all times. And the great debate today seems that it will not go away, and that is the debate of whether Michael Jordan is the greatest of all times or whether LeBron James is the greatest of all times. It just seems to be a conversation that never ends. And people compare stats and they're doing things and they're talking about the greatest of all times. In football, they say Tom Brady, even as he has retired, it will be known as the GOAT. He's the greatest of all times. He's won all these Super Bowls. Well, that conversation is not only in the sports arena, but that conversation is spilled over into the church, where you hear people make posts or they say things as to say that this person is the greatest of all times. They're the greatest preacher of all times. They're the greatest evangelist of all times. They're the greatest this. And so the church has got into that conversation of the GOAT, of who is the greatest among this one and that one and before and who's coming. And so we talk about the greatest. When I think of the greatest or we talk about it, I think all of us have to admit and say that probably, and I'll say something else a little later, but all of us can admit and say that probably every generation has had a GOAT, whether it's been in our culture or somewhere else. It's been where every generation has had somewhat of a GOAT or someone that has been deemed as the greatest of all times or the voice of all times. Even when it comes to politicians or politics, we can think of people that people consider the greatest of all times. And so those things are very in every area of life. You can see that being a part of what's being said. But now, when you talk about the church and talk about the greatest of all times and those that have come and even those that are still here with us and that are present, the GOAT, the greatest of all times, that conversation has come up. I've seen posts and I've seen the church and people post that, and I don't have an issue with it, but I want to just talk about that tonight, the greatest of all times, the GOAT. Who is the GOAT? Why do we even talk about the GOAT when it comes to ministry? Why are we even talking about that, about the GOAT? Everyone has served their purpose in their time frame, in their generation, in the time that they were here and alive. Whatever they were doing, they did it during that time. And so when we start talking about this one is the greatest of all times and the GOAT, I think we have to look at it in a little more depth. Every year, for several years before the late Bishop G. Patterson became the presiding bishop, I used to go to Memphis in December and spend 3 days with him. And I cherished those moments because I got a chance to sit down, talk with him, and somewhat pick his brain on things. And I never forget a couple of conversations we had sitting in his office in the East Rain location and sitting there, and he opening mail and stuff. And I asked him, Bishop, you got all this mail? And he said to me, as a young evangelist, I used to go to New York City and sit. And when I would preach for Bishop F.D. Washington, I would sit there and watch Bishop Washington open his mail. And I would ask him questions and stuff. And he said, some things that I do, I watched Bishop Washington do when I was a young evangelist. And now I'm pastoring, so I do that. But he would tell you in his day, even though many consider Bishop Patterson to be one of the greatest preachers of all times, they would consider him to be the GOAT. He would tell me that for him, his influence in ministry was his father, Bishop W.A. Patterson, and then Bishop F.D. Washington, which many probably, if you've never heard Bishop Washington, he was considered in his day the prince of preachers. Folk listen at him, Bishop Chandler David Owens, and all of them would listen at Bishop Washington. You would hear Bishop Patterson or Bishop Owens say phrases like "when the nightingale sings." They got that from Bishop Washington. He was somewhat of their GOAT in that day, or what you would call maybe their preaching hero. So Bishop W.A. Patterson, Bishop F.D. Washington, Bishop Owens, and all these people followed these men, and they were somewhat in their generation the GOAT of that day. They were the people that they listened to. And so when you think about it, these people that we consider great, they had people that they thought were great in their time, in their generation. They considered them the GOAT. I don't know of any greater orator than Bishop Chandler David Owens with his words and voice and the way he talked. And so they were the GOAT. Now, what I think I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and we were talking about a preacher. And when we began to talk about it, this is what he made a statement that I never forgot. We were talking about a certain preacher, and he said, this person is the millennials preaching hero. Listen to what I'm saying. He said, this person is the millennials preaching hero. And I was like, And then I thought about it, and all of us, if we admit it, let's have this conversation. All of us, if we admit it, we've had what we considered not so much the GOAT, that's the term that the world uses, but we have had preaching heroes. People that we would drive miles to see, that we would get out of class to go hear preach. They were our preaching heroes. They were the people that when we went to their services, we would be mesmerized by their preaching style, by what they said and what they did. They were, in our generation, preaching heroes to us. I remember years ago when the late Apostle Richard Hinton came, they invited him to the Church of Atlanta Lighthouse. It was the older building. I think it's on Whitehall or something like that. They invited him, and I was taking some classes in night school. I never forget this. I told the teacher, I've got to be excused for the next 3 days. And I was a young man. And you talking about just coming out of high school, but I was taking some classes for accounting. I said, I got to be excused. And he said, you got to be excused. I said, yeah, I got to be at church. And I was on the front row at the Church of Atlanta Lighthouse with Bishop Michael Spires, on the front row, mesmerized for 3 nights with the preaching of Pastor Richard D. Hinton. And so it was like the preaching hero. And I got to hear Bishop Hinton, Apostle Hinton, because he was invited in, I think it was 1977, to my uncle's camp meeting, and he couldn't make it. and a brother by the name of Daniel Johnson brought a tape of Pastor Hinton, and he was preaching a Christmas message titled "He Came." I had never met him, didn't know who he was, and he let me hear this tape. He gave it to me, and after that I was mesmerized, and every opportunity that I got to be in Pastor Hinton's presence, to see him on TV or whatever, I was right there listening at him, and he became somewhat of what we would call our preaching heroes. My uncle, preaching hero. Bishop Ronald Brown, preaching hero. Richard Hinton, preaching hero. Bishop G. Patterson, preaching hero. Bishop M.J. Pace, preaching hero. You talk about Bishop Richard White, Mr. Clean, just people that were our heroes. We would drive for miles to hear them preach and hear them do things. And this was before social media. We didn't have no social media. The word just got out, a flyer or something got out. They were going to be in the area, or they were going to be, if I remember Bishop Patterson was in Birmingham, and I drove. He was in Macon one night. I drove to Macon one night, and then Birmingham the next night. And Birmingham is at least 2.5 hours from me. So these people were our preaching heroes. So what we did is we followed them. And so when we start talking about today, there are a lot of people, they are the preaching heroes, or they're the people that we listen to. In the Baptist arena, there were people that in their day were considered the GOATs. When you think of the late C.O. Franklin, my uncle loved C.O. Franklin. I mean, I still got albums of C.O. Franklin my uncle had. I got a whole case of cassette tapes of Pastor C.O. Franklin that my uncle gave me because he loved C.O. Franklin. He would put him in and listen to him for hours. I remember one time the late Bishop Rance Allen was here, and whenever he would come, I would pick him up and we would go eat. And I never forget us being, and I was in the car and we was playing Pastor C.O. Franklin, and he loved that Baptist style preaching. He said, Martin, he said, you got to get me a copy of this. And I said, Bishop, you can have it. I just gave him the whole tape. He said, you for real? I said, yeah. In the Baptist arena, and there are probably some more, but I'm just talking about in my day of living. In the Baptist arena, Pastor C.O. Franklin was many people's preaching hero. In that day, he was the GOAT because he had albums and stuff he put out. But in that day that he lived, he was the GOAT, and many people followed him. The next person that I remember is Pastor Jasper Williams Jr. Now, he is, he preached Aretha Franklin's funeral, and they gave him a hard time, but he had been sitting there 7 hours. But when you go back and listen at him preach her father's funeral, and I've got albums. When I say album, I'm talking about records. You know what I mean? That's something. And we ain't talking about CDs. We talking about albums. And so I've got things. I remember as a young man, probably about 9, 10 years old, whatever. I remember during that day him coming on Sundays. And he was live. No social media. No, we're talking about being on the radio and him preaching, I fell in love with a prostitute. When you get behind closed doors, those messages, Psalms 23, messages that he preached. One message he preached, I'll never forget, he was talking about Jesus, and when Jesus met the disciples after he had came from the grave. And I remember him saying there's a whole lot of things that closed doors can't keep out. I mean, these were men that in their day, they were the GOATs. They were the ones that really had all the albums and stuff, and you would buy. And I'm telling you, I still got a whole bunch of them today, and cassette tapes. And so what we need to understand is every generation has had someone that has been influential. And I think that's where we really need to concentrate more when we talk about someone being the GOAT. We need to talk about people's influence on the influence, or what you would call the impact that they've had upon our lives. In the evangelical arena, in back in the day, Billy Graham, Reverend Billy Graham, was filling up stadiums and stuff. In their day, he was the GOAT. He was the GOAT in that day. He was the GOAT and the greatest of all times. Why? Because he was filling up arenas, he was filling up those things, and so he would be considered the GOAT in that day. And so when we start thinking about that, everyone that has come has had some impact or something, and that was he was the GOAT of that day. He was the GOAT of that time in that arena. So everyone in different settings, different arenas, different cultures have been that person of influence, or that person that has been the one that has had the most impact upon someone's life. And so when you start thinking about that, when we start saying this person is the greatest of all time, I think we need to really get away from the world saying of what it is, and say that they were a person that had great influence and they had impact upon the lives of people. Because some of us, we understand the impact that people have had upon our lives, and we understand where we are. And some people have had great impact. I can name the people that have impacted my life, and sometimes even when I name them, if people be like, I could tell that they influence you. Sometimes I can listen at people and see who has influenced them in ministry or whatever it is, singing or whatever it may be. They were the people that had the impact on their life. Now, my uncle, my late uncle, Evangelist Gene Martin, he had a great impact to me. I could consider him the GOAT, but now I would say, instead of being the GOAT, I would say he was the one that had the most influence, or had great influence or impact upon my life, because he trained me in what I do today. What you see me doing, he trained me from a young man to do this, voiceovers, talking. I'm comfortable in front of a camera because of him. And so those things that he influenced and impact my life. Then you had Bishop Ronald Brown from Orangeburg, South Carolina. I remember the first time I heard Bishop Brown preach. My uncle had a thing, and Bishop Brown came to my uncle's camp meeting, and I had got married that week, so I wasn't in the service. But he preached a powerful message. This has been I've been married 42 years, so you're talking 42 years ago. He preached a message called Alienation of Affection. And it was one of the greatest messages that I had heard. He preached that message. And then not only that message, but I remember us going to his church, and the Clark sisters that done that song, He Gave Me Nothing to Lose But All to Gain. And I remember my wife and them singing that song one night at his church on a Friday or Saturday night. And that Sunday morning, he preached that message, He Gave Me Nothing to Lose. I remember him preaching several messages, send Judah first. And so these men impacted my life. He was the one who said to me, don't worry about being the overnight wonder. Ask God for longevity. These folk influenced my life. So he was one that influenced my life. I just liked his style of preaching, how he broke the word down, how he shared the word. His style was something that I really, and I know Brother Brian Wilson, when he comes to my church, the singer, and he's pastoring now, whenever he comes, he'll text his friends and say, listen at him, who he sound like. And I'm not trying to sound like anybody, but he said, man, he sounds, if you close your eyes, he sounds just like it. I was in Chicago one year preaching, and a lady came up to me after church. She said, do you know my pastor, Pastor Hinton? I said, oh yeah, I've heard him a lot. She said, I could tell. She said, I closed my eyes. You got that sound like him. The late Bishop Elmer Cleveland, Bishop E. Cleveland's son. He was blind. And I was preaching in one of the meetings with Bishop Owens here, and he came up to me. He said, "You the young man that preached tonight?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I can tell." He said, "You're familiar with my brother." I said, "Who is that?" He said, "Pastor Richard Hinton." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I could tell. You sound like him a little bit." And so these were people that influenced our lives. And I think that that's what we got to talk about, the influence or the impact that they had. So Bishop Brown had an impact. Then I told you I heard Pastor Richard Hinton. Now let me share something with you that I probably haven't shared with many people. Pastor Hinton had such an impact that there are some things that I even may share today that came from him. I've got probably more cassette tapes of my uncle, Bishop Brown, Bishop Hinton, Bishop Patterson. I mean, I got a whole trunk, a foot of those big trunks, the old trunks that's filled with nothing but cassette tapes. And I got a cassette tape player so I can listen at them, but nothing but cassette tapes of these men that were influences in my life. And so when Pastor Hinton, I'll show you some of the phrases that I got from Pastor Hinton years ago, just listening at him. He would say, God has insight, foresight, and present sight. Stuff like that. Then he would he would say, "Come on, let's give him praise." And he would always, when he come to the mic, always have people giving God praise. So he was a influence. I never forget the thing that caught me the most, and I can still do this by memory today. And this was from 1977, and here we are in 2022. That he was preaching from that tape I told you when I first heard him, where he preached, "He came," and he was talking about Belshazzar. He was talking about the handwriting of God on the wall. And this is what he said. I'm going to do just what he did. I'm going to say what he said. He said these words. He said, "In the handwriting of God, the finger of God wrote on the wall and said, 'Mene, mene, tekel, you poor sin. God has numbered your kingdom, Belshazzar, and have finished it.' In other words, you're washed up, buddy. You're through. The party is over. It's time to call it a day. The count is down. The fat's thrown in the fire. It's over now. You've been weighed in the balance and found wanting." That kind of influence on my life, that I would from 1977 still remember that today. Those are the things when I say we talk about more than the GOAT conversation. We have to talk about the influence and the impact that someone had on our lives so we can deal with that as a factor. When you talk about Bishop G. Patterson, messages that you heard him preach and saying that you heard him do, influential. As you hear him talk about David's second greatest sin and living from the bottom of the barrel, stuff like that. These men were impactful upon people's lives, and these are just the ones that are upon my life. And I'm sure you've got some that have impacted you that I may not even know about. When you talk about, again, when I talk about my late brother, Bishop M.J. Pace, I remember going when he was young, and I was just getting into preaching, following him, and we would go to places he would run revivals, and I would sit there and watch him preach and give it his all. And I was like, Lord, one of these days I want to be able to preach like that. So these were men of influence. And so when we start having this GOAT conversation, we've got to probably take it away from just them being the greatest of all times. They may be great in their generation, but we've got to talk about their influence and their impact more than just their greatness. Because sometimes you can be doing a lot of stuff but don't have the impact that you think. But these people that I've talked about, and maybe somebody that you know, have had great impact and influence upon lives that even 30, 40 years later, they'll remember. And we're just talking about the men's side. We haven't even gotten to the women's side of being impactful. We haven't got to the late Bishop Ernestine Cleveland Reams. And I know we've got, the Juanita Bynums and stuff, but we haven't got to Pastor Reams. That was a pace setter, one that was influential in women's ministry on our side. We haven't got to evangelist Rita Warmack. We haven't got to what's the other lady? Oh my God. She passed, and I can't think of her name right now. It'll come to me before Juanita Sapp. We haven't got to these people that in the day. We haven't got to Pastor Maria Gardner. We haven't got to these people, these ladies that were impactful in ministry, that if you want to have that GOAT conversation, they could be in that GOAT conversation on the women's side, where they were influential, they were impactful, they did things, and they were somebody that you followed, listened to. They gave instructions. And some of the ladies that are out today and the things that they're doing today, they have to look back on this side and say they were impactful. On the Caucasian side, you have to do others. On the men's side, when it came to the 60s, those that were considered the GOATs, Oral Roberts and different ones, the late A.A. Allen that had a nine-pole tent, had his own valley called Miracle Valley. I've been there several times as a youngster. My uncle sung for him. He was his song leader. Back in that day, that could go in and fill up any auditorium, he would be considered the GOAT when it came to somewhat of the miracle healing things and those days. And so when we start talking about GOAT, I think again we need to change the narrative, change the conversation. That is not so much the greatest of all times. It's the one that has influenced and impacted our lives the most. And we've got a lot of people that have done that. They've influenced us, they've impacted our lives, and their fingerprint, their handprint, their influence upon our lives is heavy. We can feel it, we can see it. Why? Because of the fact that they came along. And so I think tonight, as we look at this GOAT conversation in the church, we talk about the greatest of all times. Let's really talk about again, and I'm done, their influence. Let's talk about their impact that they've had. There are people that had great impact that we will never know. And then there's some folk, they're not on social media, but they got great impact. You don't even know how impactful they are. Sometimes you don't even know whose lives you touching because you're not on everyone said, well, they got thousands of followers. It doesn't matter. The greatest thing is whose life are you impacting? Whose life are you touching? That's the greatest thing. And when you look at that, let me read this to you, and I'm going to be done. Let's see. Somebody I wrote down, and I think I've shared it before, but let me look at it. It's one of my podcasts, and here's the statement that I want to leave with you, and I'm going to be done. One's greatness is displayed in the lives they've touched. I want you to remember that. One's greatness is displayed in the lives they've touched. It's not about how many buildings we build. It's not about all of that. It's about the lives we've touched. And that's the important thing, is to understand that it's about the lives that we've touched, not about buildings, not about all the stuff that we think it's about. It's about the lives we've touched. And when you, at the end of the day, that's what you want people to remember you for. Not that I built buildings, not that I did this, not that I did that. The songwriter says years ago, talking about you can build cathedrals, grand and tall and all that, but only what you do for Christ will last. And so we've got to know, don't let people play you short. You may not be in the GOAT conversation with anybody, but if you have influence and you are impacting someone's life, I want you to know that your greatness is displayed in the lives you touch. I pray that you've enjoyed this tonight. Please do me a favor, like, share with someone. If you're watching live, that's fine. If you're not, if you're watching later, share with someone, because I think it's important for us to know that there are those that are the greatest, that we consider the greatest of all times, but we also understand that there's a lot of things that's going on, and the greatest thing you can do is leave your impact upon a life that even 30, 40 years from now, you'll still be in a conversation because of the impact you left upon their lives. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you tonight. Thank you so much for joining me on this live and also on this podcast. I pray that God will bless you. I pray you be encouraged. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep on loving God. Keep on doing the work of the Lord. And do remember that your greatest and your greatness is displayed in the lives you touch. May God bless you, and may all God's choice blessings be yours.